Thank you very much, David, for the invitation to speak today. As David mentioned, I'm from ICLE Local Governments for Sustainability, and I've been asked to speak to you or to bring you a little bit of inspiration about what other cities are doing, both within Europe and beyond. So essentially, my presentation will be in 3 parts. I'm going to speak to you very briefly about what ICLE is and what we do, because I imagine that might be news to most of you in the room. Secondly, we're going to look at a very kind of brief, broad snapshot of what's happening in green roofs worldwide, looking at several cities that are doing interesting things. And then I'd like to zoom in on 3 of those, if we have time. I suspect I may have too many slides, so I'm going to be keeping an eye on Hélène. I'll try to remember to look at you anyway, and yeah, you can tell me if we're running out of time. So these will be fairly, we're not going to have a whole lot of time to go into great detail, but what I'm hoping is to give you a little bit of food for thought for the discussion later today, and hopefully some ideas and some inspiration to follow up on later on. So firstly, a little bit about ICLE. So ICLE is essentially a membership network made up of local and regional governments who are committed to a vision for environmental sustainability. We've been around since the mid-90s, and we're worldwide, so there's more than 1,700 local governments that are members worldwide. Here you can see where our offices are located, so essentially all over. I am based in the European headquarters in Freiburg in southwestern Germany. We also have a small office in Brussels and Berlin, and the World Secretariat happens also to be in Germany in the city of Bonn. This is just a bit of a look at where our member cities are located within Europe. Oslo is one of our members, and you can see there's quite a few Scandinavian cities that are part of the network. But to move, I guess just before I move on, actually, a little bit more about ICLE, because you might be wondering what we actually do. So aside from being a network of members, we are often kind of working in this intersection between research and practice, which has already been mentioned a little bit today. So looking at how, so we work with researchers. For example, we're working with David's organisation on the Enable project right now, where we're interested in how the work that researchers do can be more effectively applied and used in practice by people working in cities, which happens to be something that is of great interest in Europe at the moment. A lot of our funding actually comes from the European Commission. It's very interested in supporting research impact effectively. So often we're working at that intersection. We also focus a lot on more peer-to-peer exchange. So we're interested in exchanging, or in people who work for cities talking to each other and learning from one another. So that's a little bit to do with the kind of perspective that I'll bring in today. But typically we find that the best kinds of peer-to-peer exchange don't happen with somebody like me giving you a few very brief case studies, but they actually come from people who are working in cities talking to each other. So we try to bring, wherever possible, city practitioners to events to talk to each other, and that's where it's possible to get more into the nitty-gritty of what's actually happening in one city and how that can be transferred to another. Or not, as the case may be. So where is greening thriving? Just taking a little bit of a global overview here. I came across this table while I was doing a bit of research for today. I think it's quite interesting. It shows you kind of who are the leading lights worldwide in terms of green roofs. But I think the 4th column there is quite interesting, where sure, there are a lot of cities with like a really large area of green roofs, but what does that mean in comparison to the population? So the 4th column shows you the per capita the amount of green roofs per capita that's provided, so the square meterage per inhabitant, essentially. You can see that Basel's at the top of the list there in Switzerland, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail. And so where are those kind of distributed throughout Europe? There's a few, there's a bit happening in Scandinavia. I also thought it was worth putting Oslo on the map because you are getting really active. A lot of the activity is also based in Germany. Germany for quite some time has had policies in place to support and foster green roofs. But yeah, and a lot of the activity really is kind of within Europe. So of that, on that table, 13 of those examples are within Europe. So you are in quite a good place to be in terms of where the action is happening and where there's potential to learn from other cities. Looking globally, so I don't expect you to take all of this information in, but I think it is maybe useful or interesting to see where things are happening and just to focus on a couple of those. So Malmo, interestingly, has been the first Scandinavian city to introduce the green space factor as a tool to support green roofs, which I gather is something that City of Oslo is also exploring in its strategy. Unfortunately, my Norwegian's terrible. I wasn't able to read the strategy itself. So Malmo since 2001 has been exploring this, so has some runs on the board in terms of experience. London, actually kind of a relative newcomer to fostering green roofs, but has made a lot of progress just in the last decade through some major planning system changes. Rotterdam, so I think you're going to hear from Kalai in a moment about hopefully some of the Dutch experience. So I won't say much about Rotterdam except that they have had a lot of success through more the carrot approach, apparently, through grants, tax offsets and example projects. Looking a bit further afield, Toronto in Canada has been very active on green roofs for at least the last 10 years. In fact, it was 10 years ago that green roofs became mandatory on new developments of a certain size. Okay, before we go into some close-ups though, I'm interested in kind of setting a bit of a framework that hopefully will make it easier to compare or to analyse the different policy tools that are available, because there are many. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with this particular model for understanding behavioural change. It gets a little bit back to what Anders was saying earlier in terms of it is all about changing behaviours and finding tools to introduce and support new perspectives. So, so this is just one model that exists, which I quite like, I find quite useful. Enable, engage, exemplify, and encourage as 4 kinds of clusters of different policy options that you might consider. And to say a little bit about what each one means. So enable is really about taking obstacles away, getting rid of any laws that might be standing in the way of encouraging green roof uptake, also providing information and guidance. Engage is more about working with people, which is obviously something that's been identified as really important here and is already happening to some extent through the Green Buildings Alliance, for example. Getting people on board, really. Exemplify, so here we're talking about demonstration projects, about especially what the city can do to lead by example and encourage others. And then finally, encourage. And encourage is sort of meant in a very broad sense of the term here, so both carrots and sticks. So carrots being what kind of financial incentives can you provide, and sticks being what kind of regulations can be established in order to enforce uptake, essentially. And so generally speaking, the first to enable and engage those kinds of clusters of policy instruments might help you to get people on board who are already quite likely to act and just need a little bit of support. But it's exemplify and encourage that really are more likely to mobilise a wider scope of action and essentially kickstart change, which is what the whole idea is. Okay, so looking at a couple of examples though, very briefly, I think it's worth having a look at Basel just because they are so advanced here. They really did get started quite early and have the highest area of green roofs per capita in the world, if I'm not wrong, at 5.7. So what's happening in Basel in terms of this policy framework, or what has been happening? Okay, so encourage. Starting with financial incentives. So Basel actually got started in 1996 already with subsidising green roofs at 20 Swiss francs per square metre, and then ran a subsequent campaign, both times accompanied with a lot of awareness raising, a lot of working with stakeholders. But they progressed from that. So actually in 2002, building and construction law was amended to make it mandatory for green roofs, as I understand, with no exceptions. So a lot of cities have kind of a starting point, a certain size of building or a certain cost of works, but in Basel, there are actually no exceptions. There's an element of enable, including employment of an expert within council who provides guidance to interested households or building owners. And I think the element of engage has been very important from what I've read when it comes to Basel. So on the one hand, this national poll was conducted before the first subsidy program commenced, and this poll concluded that there was a level of support for a tax that would fund environmental initiatives with a focus on energy saving at the time. And this was essentially the fund that became the subsidy, the pool of finances for these green roofs. There was also a lot of stakeholder consultation before the first program was established, which included both environmental organisations and business groups. Didn't find a lot on Exemplify for Basel. That's not to say that it didn't exist, but I think one of the things about this case is that because it happened quite a while ago, there's a few case studies online. They're all sort of drawing on the same sorts of material, the same sources. I think it would be interesting to speak to someone within Basel City Council at the moment to find out what has been the story there and what the current situation is, because a lot of this information is based on some time ago, the point that Basel got to, and in terms of what they're doing more recently, I'm not so aware. Just to touch on a couple of factors that are maybe non-policy factors in a way, it seems that local acceptance for green roofs was already quite strong in Basel, even before the first subsidy program commenced. There was throughout Switzerland an interest in and an understanding of the value of green roofs as an element of eco-construction. As I said, this particular electricity bill tax that funded the subsidy programs was obviously quite important materially. And research practice collaboration, which was also touched on before by Harold, I think, the importance of the research community in providing the evidence base and the technical guidance. This was a key factor with a university based in Zurich and a particular champion from that university becoming involved in the whole process. And also I think the experimentation factor and allowing room for experimentation and improvement, because the first subsidy program was actually found to result in kind of imperfect green roofs. They weren't they weren't so well suited to fostering biodiversity. And this was a significant factor in changes to the second subsidy program, where actually a lot more funding per square metre was offered. And particular guidelines were also established for kinds of green roofs that would really foster habitat for wildlife and birds. Okay, to look at quite a different case study here, Hamburg in Germany. And I think it's important to point out that the German cities do have a bit of a head start because they have had for a long time. I think since in 2002 there were over 100 German cities that could be identified as having policy incentives for green roofs. So they are starting from quite a high point. But what's interesting about Hamburg is that it's only 5 years since it established a new green roof strategy, which has quite a diverse mix of policy instruments, and was to run until the end of this year. So it's actually a policy that's just recent, or a set of policies that has just recently been tested. And what does it look like? So on the encourage side, two kinds of financial incentives primarily. One being the direct one, a subsidy of up to 60%, I think it is, per square metre of green roof. And they're committing in total €3 million to this over the 4 or 5 year time period. Also indirect financial incentives in the form of split wastewater fees. And there's also this ecological compensation measure that includes a suite of possible measures, including green roofs. But that's something that's actually been around in local planning policy since the 90s, so it's not so much a new instrument that's being introduced. On the enable side, there's quite a lot of information provided online at the moment on the city administration's website. So including guidelines and frequently asked questions. There's also, I think, of interest perhaps, this economic analysis that's been done in 2017, looking at the business case for green roofs, which is something that Kalai is going to talk about business cases, and I don't know much about them, but just to point that out, that Hamburg is also, the cost question is very critical there. There's been a real emphasis on dialogue in the strategy, like with a whole lot of things happening, workshops, information events, site visits, and also this environmental partnership between the city administration and key business groups, which is something that's existed for a while. It's predating the strategy, but the strategy is trying to also take advantage of this partnership. And of course, it's been identified as really important, this engagement with stakeholders. And then finally, Exemplifies is happening to some extent in Hamburg with some particular flagship project on the Ministry for the Environment building, as well as a green roof on the Hafen City University campus. But yeah, I think it's quite interesting to note that there's actually an evaluation report that's been published quite recently on the implementation of this policy. What's happening here is another research practice collaboration where researchers from the Hafen City University are following the implementation of this policy set and assessing it. And they're interested in looking at its success and looking at its transferability to other cities primarily. So yeah, actually you can read a bit about, if you can read German, thanks Helen, about how successful it's been. And to be honest, there are some challenges. They had this really ambitious target of 100 new hectares of green roof by 2020, and as of last year, they had only reached a fifth of that. So it's unclear whether that target will be met, but it's not looking all that hopeful. And there's some theories about that, whether possibly the financing for the direct subsidies is too low, whether further guidance is needed. There's also a big need for housing in Hamburg, and the need to build cheap and affordable housing relatively quickly has been cited as a conflicting issue here. But I think it's also interesting to refer back to the Basel case, right, where there was a subsidy program and then they found that they had to do only a few years later another one and to redesign it. So I think, yeah, this element of experimentation and maybe not getting it right, not getting it perfect the first time, but not seeing that as failure, but as actually being an opportunity to learn from it and continuously improve is a really important lesson here. Just really quickly, I know I've only got a couple of minutes, but I thought it might be interesting to look outside Europe as well, to the example of Portland in the US, which in terms of size anyway, in terms of population is maybe a little bit comparable to Oslo. And here they've got like a couple of different policy tools that aren't used in Hamburg or Basel. So again, both indirect and direct financial incentives. But in the indirect ones, this idea of a density bonus scheme. So in exchange for providing a green roof, getting the opportunity to build some additional floor area. Certainly something to look at in terms of engaging the private sector. And the incentives that Portland provided are, so the direct financial incentives at least, as I understand, no longer provided. So this is another, thanks Helen, another thing to consider, that incentive programs can be used to kickstart interest and then to later on let it progress into something else. And that's really what's happened in Portland. Since 2018, so quite recently, you have mandatory green roofs for all new buildings exceeding a certain size. And I just want to make the connection between the example setting policies and the encouragement ones, because it was actually the city itself that opted to have mandatory green roofs on new buildings and redevelopments of city-owned properties of a certain size in 2005, and that has directly, it seems, fed into a new mandatory requirement for private buildings 13 years later. So I think understanding how a policy can evolve and change form is important here. Okay, but that was really quick, so I've just included a series of links here if you'd like to find out anything more about one of those case studies. And the last one comes from this green roof think tank, which I think is actually based in Portland, and they're fostering a lot of international exchange worldwide, and they're actually holding a virtual summit on green roofs and walls in November. So that might be one to watch. You don't actually have to travel to Portland to be part of it, and there's obviously a lot of information available. And the other thing to point out, all three case studies that I showed are actually members of the Acclay network. So I would be happy to set up any sort of contact if you're interested in speaking to the people directly involved in these programs. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Elenor. So what we'll do now is we have quite a bit of time, so we'll have questions first, and then we'll have a Mentimeter question or two at the end. So, okay. Any questions on inspiration from Europe?
Yeah, hello, it's Terje Arbog from, I'm working in Copenhagen together with Untitled Chapter. You referred to Copenhagen as one of the cities with, it was referred to 510 square meters of, or 1,000 square meters of green roofs. I think the challenge in Copenhagen is that there are no functional requirements to green roofs. It's really a cosmetic issue. And Copenhagen is full of green roofs with very low functional value. And actually the city of Copenhagen is claimed to have more or less given up because it's all these extensive roofs. Do you have any recommendation, or are there any specific functional requirements when you are referring to green roofs?
So just a disclaimer, because I'm not an expert on green roofs at all. But it sounds quite similar to, in a way, the Basel situation, where the first round of subsidies resulted in a lot of extensive green roofs, but not having this particular function to foster biodiversity. And this was something that was amended later on with the second program. And there it was found that there really needed to be, as a minimum, guidelines in place. I'm not sure if Copenhagen has guidelines, but they're not binding, or what is the situation? Oh, sorry, you've lost your microphone.
I should also make a waiver because I'm very new to this business as well. But as far as I know, they don't have a functional guideline.
Guidelines, yeah. So I mean, I think that would be necessary. Yeah. Really. Yeah.
But do you know these guidelines in Basel, or where to find it?
We can talk afterwards. Yeah, I mean, I'm not working directly in the city, but potentially I could put you in touch with somebody who is working there. I think that would be the best.
Any other questions on encourage, exemplify? No? No inspiration from Europe? We're doing everything fine here. Do we have?
Talk too fast.
Yeah, maybe I can ask the audience. Could we say that we have functional requirements for building green roofs from a municipal point of view, or is it up to every building owner how the roofs are specified? Yeah.
In a way we have, because if you need to take care of the stormwater, you need to make roofs that really can take care of the stormwater. So in this direction, in this way, you have some specifications. But that's the only one, as far as I know.
Thanks. Here you go.
I can just continue on that because, well, even though I'm not familiar to any legal requirements or good descriptions on functionality of green roofs, if we have BREEAM certified projects, then that helps, because then we normally have an ecologist in the process early on, and which consult us how to build a good functional ecological green roof.
And is the city looking at, maybe David, you can answer this, or somebody else, but is the city administration looking at providing guidance itself, like developing dedicated guidance documents or employing a consultant to advise people who are undertaking such projects? Are these kinds of things part of the discussion?
There's a guidance which is not only for green roofs, but there is a green point system in Oslo called the blue-green factor. And green roofs do score a lot of points within other things that you can do of blue and green landscaping on the property. And there is also within that system then a sort of compensation logic, that if you have little space on the ground, you can compensate by using green roofs. So,
and that's been around for a while, though. That's not part of the new strategy. That's an existing instrument.
That's an instrument that was started 5-6 years ago as a collaboration between Oslo and Bærum municipalities, along with a series of consultants. And it's been through a number of revisions. And the blue-green factor in Oslo has become simplified because it was apparently too complicated to use. And one of the things that dropped out of that first version, which is not in the present version, is the endemic plant species, or stedegenarter, as we say in Norwegian. So the biodiversity aspect of it's been simplified. But the stormwater is very, very crucial, as Bent was saying.
But that might be something that can be built on later on. Starting with a simple version that gets people into it, and then increasing the complexity.
So I'd love somebody else to answer the questions, but
there's someone over
here. We have Brooke over there, so.
Yeah, I have a different question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for this very well-structured talk. The question I had is, I mean, so far I've seen people almost exclusively focusing on establishing green roofs, and there's very little discussion about maintaining green roofs. And I wonder if, with the cases that you've been looking at or the governments you've been working on with, is anybody providing incentives or guidance on maintaining these green roofs once they've been established?
I'm not aware of any specific. It's a very good point, and I think this is one of the reasons why Hamburg has struggled a bit with the uptake. That building owners are still concerned not just about the capital costs, but about the additional costs over the lifespan of the building. And that's where I think these business case, these cost analysis papers can be really important. But maybe also some of the instruments that are connected to tax offsets rather than one-off subsidies potentially could also address the maintenance concern.